Hi, Amber. I'm going to tell a story. It's sort of a lengthy story, and it'll be in bits and pieces because that's the way it's going to work. I used this story for years as I was a teacher, shop teacher, and use it in my safety section. There's things that take place all around you. That's why they call them accidents. And so you have to prepare yourself for it mentally, and you need to be prepared so that you know what to do when and how to do it when the situation arises. This took place a long time ago in my life. It emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually changed my life, and I think you'll see some of that as I go through it, and hopefully you'll get a little bit of knowledge of Grandpa out of the story as time goes by and I tell the story. Way back in 1980, I was living in Orange County. I had graduated from college and had taken a job as a mechanic with a family friend, and that was all good. But Grandma was pregnant with Ruthie, and she was getting ready to burst. And we decided that I needed to get a job that had full medical benefits and maybe made a little more money. And so I heard through my father-in-law, Grandma's dad, that they had some openings for painters at Todd Shipyard. He worked there at the time, by the way. So I decided I would apply for a job and see if I could get a journeyman painter job, which paid pretty well at the time. And so I went down one day and went through the application, then the interview process, and because I had had a lot of skill with painting in college, I had done that and paid for it. I had the ability, so they hired me as a journeyman painter. And then I had to go back and tell my mechanic friend, boss, that I was leaving. And that was a sad day and a sad point in my life. It's one of those things you kind of wish you had never done, and if you could take it back, you would change it. It hurt him, and I carried that with me for the rest of my life. I still do, because he was a friend, and that's no way to treat somebody. But I felt I needed to do it, and of course I was encouraged by my father-in-law and mother-in-law to make the change because it would mean more money and benefits, and well, I succumbed to pressure and went ahead and took the job. I ran into them later in life several times, and always humbled by their kindness and their love, even though I had been an ogre and had violated a friendship in a way that I can't forgive myself for. So that's not what this story is about. It's not about making choices. It's not about wishing that you'd done something. Maybe it's not. Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe wishing you could change things that had happened. I started working at Todd Shipyard, and I learned from my first few minutes that I was in a totally alien environment for me. And it meant I needed to adapt, and I needed to do what I could do to be as a successful person as I possibly could. My first day there, I was tasked with spray painting a storage shed, which sounds like a relatively easy job, except for I didn't know where anything was. I didn't know where the storage shed was. They told me, so I had to ask people, where is this, blah, 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 blah. And finally I found it out. So I got there, and they said that there would be equipment there to paint with, and there was paint, but there was no equipment. So I had to walk back to where the paint department was, because this is a big facility. And I asked, where do I get the equipment to paint with? And you'd have thought that I had just called the guy, some bad name and had thrown stuff around, because this guy just went off. And, this is my first day. I'm within an hour of starting this new job. And they expected me, of course, to know where all the equipment was and where I could get stuff from. And to do that, I had no idea where anything was. So they gave me a quarterman, and he took me and told me where a paint pot was, and the hose, and he gave me a spray gun nozzle, which they were supposed to have already done, but of course no one had figured that one out. Of course I didn't know. So I go and I get the paint pot, and I get the hose, and I load it on a cart, and I push it however far it was to get it to where I was supposed to be doing my job. Well, I get there and I start feeling the hose, and I go, gosh, this feels really, really hard. I wonder if it was cleaned out properly, because it felt like rock. It was wound up and stuff. And then I went to try to open the pressure pot, the paint pot, to put paint in it and mix it and use it to spray with. I couldn't get the pot open. I worked and got the 4 little screws that hold it down, butterfly screws, finally broke loose, and I got those off. Could not get the cap off, and I beat on that thing. I had a crescent wrench, an adjustable wrench. It would not open. So here I am with this hard hose and a pressure pot that won't work. So now it's like, well, where do I get one that will work? And so I walked that big old long distance back to where the painters department was. And I take a lot more verbal abuse for being a total moron that I couldn't do my job. And another lead man came, and he had a cart, fortunately, and so he drove me someplace else that I had never been and would never have been able to find if I had wanted to. And we loaded a pressure pot and another hose, spray hose, onto his cart, and he drove me back to the shed where I was supposed to be painting. So now I'm at a point I can actually do something. And I'm getting everything set up. And about this time, a quarterman comes by. I was talking about the progression of leadership. You have apprentice, then you have journeyman, and then you have a lead man, and then you have a quarterman, and then you have the foreman at the top. So that's pretty much the line of people that you have. And each one of those is responsible to the person above them, basically. So I was directly responsible to my lead man, who came and gave me all the work. So anyway, at this point, my quarterman had come around that was responsible for this area of the shipyard and the jobs that were being done. And of course, he wasn't happy with me. And he pointed that out very, very clearly. Just so you'll know, in a shipyard, you don't talk normal. Every other word, or sometimes just every word, is profanity. And I kid you not, I sat and I would listen to sentences completely that had no verb or no other word or part of speech than profanity. And, you know, of course, everything was related, you know, this whatever, blah, 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 and I went to blah, 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 and so, just so you'll know, that's was common language. And I didn't realize that when I started there, but unfortunately, I learned it pretty fast because I'm a fast learner. I'm a verbal learner, so I learn things verbally very, very fast. I can learn things visually as well very fast. And so I learned to use that same language because that was the means of communication. But at this point, I wasn't aware of that. And so I was somewhat taken aback because I had worked in a Christian university, then I'd worked in an auto shop that was run by a Christian, and here I am in this shipyard that's totally different. So needless to say, my quarterman wasn't happy with me. So by this time it was lunchtime. So we went to lunch, and I double checked with my lead man that I was going back to the same place because I didn't know. And he told me to check with the quarterman. And so I went and waited to talk to him, and of course I'm standing there and waiting to talk to him, and finally he addresses me with, you know, like, what the do you want? And so I simply said, well, do you want me to continue where I was? Because you were pretty, you know, unhappy with what I was doing. And a long string of explicatives later, basically, he said, yes, and get it done. So I headed back over there. I mixed up the epoxies, and I started spraying this shed, and the lead man came by a little later, and of course wasn't pleased with what I was doing or how I was doing it. and pointed that out. And then he proceeded to show me what he wanted me to do, which was exactly what I had been doing. But he wanted to make sure that I knew that I wasn't doing it correctly, because what I was doing, even though it was the same thing he was doing, wasn't what he wanted me to do. So he wanted me to do what he was doing, which really was what I was doing. But thankfully I finished. Then I needed to clean the equipment. So that was a whole nother bucket of beans. So I eventually got the equipment all cleaned up and ready for whoever was to use it next. And by that time, it was pretty much the end of the workday. So I'd basically spent the whole day painting this small work shed, getting paid, which back then was really good money. But I soon found out that that wasn't the biggest waste of time and money that would take place on my experiences there. Anyway, that has only a lead into what the story was, the true story. After a few weeks, or a month, I guess, I was put on night shift. And so I started working from about 3:30 to midnight. And that was kind of nice because you got a paid differential. There was a little more pay. And then oftentimes the night shift would end up continuing on into the swing shift. And there were several times when I would work 12 or 14 hours. Now, the problem with that is grandma's at home with two little tiny children, and she's pulling her hair out at times because she's left alone for so many hours on end with me off trying to earn money. So that wasn't the best situation in the world either. Like I said, if we could make our choices better, if we could turn back the clock, but you can't. And so I had to make the best of the situation. So I'm working on the night shift. And one of the jobs that a group of us were tasked with was to paint some barges that had been brought into dry dock. And a dry dock is a big dock. It'll either be submerged and then they pump the water out of it. They close it like a bathtub. Or it'll be raised up out of the water using large airbags, and they'll actually raise the dry dock and then they lock it into place. In my case, this particular evening, that was what the situation was. So we would go to work. We would get dressed specifically for the job we were doing. We were using some very caustic thinners and epoxies, paints, to paint these dry docks. And the reason they were so caustic is The dry dock didn't have to come into, or the barge didn't have to come in to be painted as often as a regular ship, and so they would use these paints that basically had poisons in them that were designed so that as barnacles and crustaceans would grab on and try to chew into the paint to adhere themselves to the bottom or sides of the barge or vessel, whatever it was, that it would kind of kill them off, and it would take them a while to chew their way through this poisonous paints, or these poisonous paints, and so they wouldn't have to be maintained as often. So we had to wear special clothing for this job, and we were given jumpsuits, but then we were given those white jumpsuits, like you see in hazardous situations, and rubber boots and long neoprene gloves, and we were issued respirators anyway, but we were given full face respirators, which means it fits over your whole face, and it's an airline respirator, which means you have this little box that a hose hooks to, and it blows air into you from a safe source. And so we would get all decked out in our little white suits with our black boots and black gloves, and we would tape ourselves up with duct tape so that there weren't any openings or cracks or whatever when we were working, because we didn't want to get any of this paint accidentally on our bodies, or the thinner that was used, because the thinner was toxic as well. And so we wanted to make sure that we were safe from that. And we would deck ourselves out. And when we finally got to the workplace, eventually we would put our full face respirators on, and would eventually basically tape those to the paint hoods we had, because we had paper hoods that we would wear as well. And so we were sealed off pretty much until, break time came, or lunchtime came, or we were able to, break time came, or lunchtime came, or we were able to do whatever and leave the work site. And when you're in a situation like that where you're working with paints and so forth, oftentimes what a worker would do is basically, and what you would do is you take plastic covers, which were like safety shields from a full face shield, and you would tape those over it so that you had maybe 3 or 4 layers of these plastic sheeting, and you would just use masking tape or painter's tape to hold those in place. And then as you're working, if you get spray or you get other stuff on your face, you could peel that off, and it would make it much easier to see. And that was faster and easier than taking a cloth with paint thinner and trying to wipe your face every time something would spray on your face or whatever. It was expensive, but it was the quickest way to keep yourself so you could see what you were doing and working. The hardest part with a respirator, even with a inline respirator, is that as you work, you sweat, and so it would steam up the insides of the mask. Now, if you had a airline respirator where it's blowing air into you, you could crank the air up a little bit more and hopefully keep that from happening, but you still ended up with a fogged up inside. And of course, you can't reach inside and wipe it off, because, well, that would expose you to all of the chemicals that you're working with. So we're decked out in all these suits, gloves, face shields. We even had to wear our helmets on top. Sometimes guys would tape those on with either painter's tape or duct tape as well, so that their helmet wouldn't fall off, because if they dropped a crate of paint on you, a pallet of it, you wanted to make sure your head was safe, so that even though the rest of your body would be smashed into squishy little goo, at least your brain might still be, they'd be able to figure out what it was after they peeled the cracked helmet off. Because it was required you wear a helmet, safety glasses everywhere in this yard, or you could be fired. And so even when you're working in situations like that, you always, no matter what it was, whether you were inside of a fuel tank painting it, wherever you were, you kept your helmet on because that was a requirement. And it did save a lot of head injuries. So that, that was a good requirement, but it was still annoying and it was difficult at times to make all that work. On this particular evening, late in March, we were working on this barge. There was a crew, I think, of about 14 of us. Most of us were up on top. I believe we had 2, maybe 3 paint lines going down underneath and along the sides, where there was a painter and a tender right behind the painter. And basically the painter held the spray nozzle, the tender held the spray line. Because the pressure was so high, it was hard for the painter to manage the spray nozzle and the hose at the same time. So you had basically 2 people there to try to control what was happening. So I was on top and I was helping with mixed paints, and we had pallets of paints that had been lowered onto the deck of the barge, and it was done that they did that every night because these paint thinner was so caustic. It had a very low flash point, which means that if it sat out in the sunshine somewhere, it's a good chance that it would overheat and explode. And so because they wanted to keep everybody from dying from paint cans exploding and killing them and burning them to death, they had us do this in the evening when it was much, much cooler, even though it was March on the ocean and, it's cold there anyway. But this was our job. And so we would have these pallets of thinner and pallets of this special paint lowered each night. And of course, they would always lower more than they needed because, they would hope that you would get more done than you could do, even with a crew working. And so when you're working in a crew and you're spraying a lot of this paint, I would call it, it was an epoxy finish that would go on. When you're doing that, it goes through a lot of paint. And so you were constantly taking these 7-gallon cans of epoxy paint, and you were mixing it with this thinner, which was caustic, and you were mixing them together, and then they would be taken to whichever paint pot needed to be filled up. And so it happened to be my turn to operate the air mixer, which, if you've ever been in an industrial kitchen and you see their big mixing machines or bread or dough mixing machines, that's basically what it looked like. It was this big drillish machine with these pieces on the end that rotated, and they would help stir up and mix the paint so that it would mix up and down inside easily, and so it would take less time for you to mix that paint. And so this was a constant flow. You would get a new can, usually about half full, and then they would fill the other portion of it up to just about to the rim with thinner, and then you would set the mixer in and you would turn it on, and it was heavy, so you had to hold it in place, and you would lift it up and down, up and down, up and down as it stirred and mixed these paints together, or the thinner and the epoxy. Then somebody on the outside that could really see what was happening, because operating the the blender, the mixer, you couldn't really see what was happening to the paint because you couldn't bend over that far. So somebody else had to be there, and they would slap your arm, let you know that it was done. And so you would lift this mixer out and set it on, you know, a tarp or something that was there, so they could take that can of paint, and then they would bring in another one, and then they would fill it with the thinner, and then you would start going. And that's what you would do. And this went on for basically hours. And so it was my turn to run the mixer, because it was physically challenging to hold this device up so it didn't just rub against the bottom of the can. And of course you had to lift it up and down, and not lift it too far so it sprayed paint all over everybody, because, you know, then they wouldn't like you and would probably beat you up. So you had to be kind of careful with that part. So I'm mixing paint. I'm getting slapped on the arm, lifting the mixer, another bucket's brought in. I put the mixer blades in, they fill it up with paint thinner from another can, and then they slap me a couple of times to let me know that they were done, because I have to pay attention to what they're doing, even though I can't really see them well because my face shield's all fogged up. So I would start mixing, and the next thing I would know, someone would slap me hard on the arm to let me know that, hey, you're done. And you know, sometimes they would even try to yell it at you, but you're yelling through a mask that has air blowing into your face. It's taped to your face, your head, so, you know, and so that's what you hear. Even though all they're saying is profanity anyway, but that's what you would hear. So, I'm mixing paint. And as I'm mixing this one batch of paint, I'm noticing that it's taking a little bit longer to mix. And so I'm kind of wondering, why am I not getting slapped in the arm to move on? And so I stopped the aerator, the mixer, and I start looking around. And I'm not really seeing guys beside me like there had been. You know, the blurred images of people through the fogged up lens. And so I keep looking around, and I see some shape running across, at least I would assume it was running across in front of me. And I'm looking at this going, gosh, how could that guy run? He's got a hose attached to his waist, and it's hard enough just to walk dragging that hose. And then another body runs closer in front of me, and it, whoa, whoa. And so I see this image, and you know, it's not very light out. I mean, we had lights, but still it's nighttime and it's not super bright. And you know, my brain's kind of trying to figure out what's up. And slowly, the realization of what's taking place starts to sink in. That, woo, woo, while this guy was running by yelling, probably meant fire, fire. And I'm standing by open paint cans. I'm standing by these big 55-gallon drums of paint thinner, which have had that little round lid unscrewed off of them so that they could keep pumping the thinner out. And there's already thinner pumped into 5 or 7 gallon cans so that it's ready for the next guy. And I'm thinking, fire, fire. This stuff has a flash point of 98 degrees, which means that if it gets hotter than 98 degrees in any way, shape, or form, it'll burst into flames. So I'm, of course, let go of the mixer, because no longer do I really care what happens to it. And I'm hooked up to an airline. So I step off the little stand I was on where you have to stand when you're working, mixing that stuff. And I unhooked my airline, which meant now I'm not getting air blown into me. My face mask is fogged up already. So I pull the tape off one side of it and I try to look and see, what's going on through the crack. And as I turn to my right, I notice this black, gray, orange, red, yellow stuff billowing up from underneath the barge, and it's billowing up right where the ramp to get off of the barge was on the dock side. And they only had this one ramp that they had built on. And so I'm thinking, okay, I got to go the other direction.